I'll show you how you put your pistons together. Of course, we got our connecting rod. Got our wrist pin and 2 snap rings. I already put 1 snap ring in here where our wrist pin goes. And the reason I do that is so that whenever I slide this wrist pin in, it hits the stop. Now, our rebuild kit came with some new piston wrist pin bushings. These things are supposed to be sized, and I don't have a way to size them. But what's funny though, there's already a slit in them. So for me to get a solid bushing and a slit cut in there, or with the slit, I'm gonna cut off so much of that bushing it's kind of useless. So I took my wrist pin and stuck it in my old one. It's fairly tight. There's a little bit of wiggle, but not much. I mean, the manual says no more than 1/1000th of an inch. So since I can't physically see it moving, I'm going to run them. So, as I have said before, we have arrows on our piston point towards the front of our engine. So the front of the engine is actually the side that I have the snap ring on. Now on our connecting rod, there's an oil hole on one side right here. See, the other side does not have it. It's just the one. Now this oil hole will shoot oil onto our camshaft. Now if our rod is sitting in the motor, you know, as if it would be running, our oil hole needs to be to the right, looking from the front of the tractor. So it'll be like this. Or in the case of mine, it's going to be towards the small side of the piston. And basically, to install these pistons, they're pretty simple. Put the rod in, slide your pin through it, it's installed. However, we want to put some more of our grease on there. Once again, due to the simple fact it's going to set a while before it gets ran. I'm going to go ahead and stick my rod in here in the correct direction, like that. Now I'm going to take my wrist pin and we're going to put a little bit of grease on it. Okay, so we got our pin greased up. We're going to slide it into our piston. In through our rod and all the way to the other side of the piston. And I'm going to take just a little bit of extra grease and just kind of cram it down in there. Alright, so and now before I put the last snap ring in, I'm going to flip it over and verify that the front of the engine is that way. You can see the arrow, it's that way. Oil hole is on the right hand side, shooting to my camshaft. So that piston's in there correct. So now I'll lay it down on the workbench and I'll install the other snap ring. Now, snap ring can technically go either way, but the way I've always been taught, these are stamped out of some piece of steel. So you have a rolled edge where the die comes down, and then you got the shear edge. I've always been told put the rolled edge out. Now, is it going to hurt anything if you don't? Probably not. Just squeeze our snap ring and slide it in. Make sure everything moves nice and free. And there's our piston ready to go into the engine. So now I just have to do it 3 more times. Okay, so we got all of our rods and pistons put together. One thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of this was, remember I said whenever you file fit your rings, you need to mark your pistons with your numbers. They're going to match up to your numbers on your rods. So there's number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. So these guys are now ready to go into the engine.
Okay, so to install the piston in the engine block, you're going to need your ring compressor. And there's many styles that you can buy. You can buy a tapered compressor that work extremely well. The only downside is you have to buy it for the size of the bore. So if you're doing multiple engines that are the same bore, they're great. If you have different bores, they're get expensive. There's another type of compressor that is a piece of metal with some worm gears around it. And you basically slide it on the piston and crack the worm gears and it compresses it. They work. They're a pain in the butt. Then they have this style, which basically you have a band and a clamp. And basically this thing is ratcheted. So you slide that on your piston and you grab it, and you can sit here and compress your rings. And I can actually let go of the pliers and it'll hold it. So that'll kind of help you to wiggle it and line it up. And if you need them just a little tighter, you can squeeze them a little bit. If you need a little looser, just kind of pull back on the ratchet and you can ease it open a little bit. So this style works pretty well. Now when you go to install these pistons, of course your bores are dry now, from where we machined them or honed them in my case, whatever. So you need to lubricate these bores. But the easiest way to do that is a towel, paper towel, whatever, and put a little bit of oil on it and just run it down in there. And pretty much any oil will do at this point. This is actually some old racing oil with some high zinc in it. They claim that high zinc is great on older engines. I have no idea. I'm not a chemist or metallurgist or whatever you want to call them. But it'll probably help a little bit with this break-in period. So just kind of coat the bore a little bit. And we're going to want to take our piston and coat it a little bit. Probably what I'm going to do is once I actually install these, I'll come back with the engine assembly grease and put a little bit extra on the cylinder wall, just due to the fact it's going to be a while before I get around to actually firing this engine, since I still have to rebuild the rest of the tractor. Okay, so now when you install these pistons, remember your arrow goes towards the front of the tractor, and your rings have to be indexed properly. Now, if you remember, when I installed these oil ring right here, I went ahead and indexed it. However, my compression rings are not. So they need to be oriented. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead, and one other thing I probably should go ahead and tell you to do now. Your rod bearing. Go ahead and put some assembly lube on your rod bearing. And I'm sure that by the time I go to fire this up, most of that will be off of there anyway, but I'm going to prime the oiling system. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go ahead and stick this piston down in here. And it's going to rest on this lower ring for a minute. I have my arrow to the front. And the way that I like to index my compression rings, I'll find the top oil spreader ring or end ring, whatever you want to call it. And I'll try to move my lower ring as far as I can away from it, which is going to be about right there. Then my second ring, we're going to turn over here about a third of the distance away from this guy. And usually if I only have 2 compression rings, I'll put them 180 out. But since I have 3, we're going to do them 120 degrees apart. So I have one here, and one here. That way my ring gaps are as far away apart as they can possibly be. So now that I have that set, I'm going to take my ring compressor, and I probably just moved all my rings, and we're going to go down here to the bottom ring. And we're just going to compress him. And it's down in the block. So let me double check my other upper rings. See, we got one there, one there, one there. Okay, so they didn't move. That's great. Pull our compressor up here to them. And we'll compress them. And also make sure you get all of your oil ring, because as you see, I missed it over here. So I need to release my ring compressor. Just make sure I grab all my rings, and we'll compress them back. Now you see how easy that piston slides? That's what you want. Now you may have to tap it in with a hammer. And when I say tap it in, I mean just tap it in. You know the old movie. I ain't gonna say it due to copyright, but you know what I'm talking about. Just tap it in. And you may have to play with your rings a little bit. It's one of the nice things about this compressor. You can compress it and release it just a little bit. And we'll take the end of a hammer handle, that piston's now in. I think I'm actually hitting my crank. Hopefully I didn't hit it with the bolt. That piston's in. Let's spin it over here and make sure I didn't screw up my crankshaft. Ha, perfect. My crankshaft was actually perfectly aligned, believe it or not, that my rod went right over top of it. That's something I should have warned about before. Usually whenever I install pistons, I have the crank on the bottom of the stroke. But I didn't on this one just because I had everything lined up and it just didn't cross my mind. But that rod lined up perfectly with the crank. It's great. Should be no issue there. Yeah. I just spun it just to make sure I didn't hit it with the bolt. Okay, so there's our rod coming through. Now just like whenever we mic'd our main bearings, or rod bearings rather, remember the key. Key's on this side. So I need to install this main cap this direction. And just like the rod, we're going to add some assembly lube to the bearing. Line up our keyways. And install our cap. And then we put on our nuts. And before I torque them, I like to bring them down to the bottom so that way I have the shortest length on the end of the torque wrench as possible. Some people say that the extensions don't matter, others do. I don't really know if it matters or not, but I can say that taking stuff apart, you do lose torque with extensions. Going together, I don't know. But there's that. So I'm just going to run this bolt up, or the nut rather. And I'm just running them up snug right now. Okay. And it still moves pretty free right now, which is good. I'm just giving it a spin just to make sure everything's traveling nice and easy. Do that with every cylinder or every piston. And you want to do that because this will show you if you've bound anything up. And of course, the more pistons you put in here, the harder it's going to turn. That's why I say do it one at a time. Because if all of a sudden it gets extremely tight, you know something's wrong right there. Versus putting everything in and being like, oh crap, what the heck happened? So let me bring that up here, and I'm going to go ahead and torque this guy down. Manual calls for 45 to 50 foot-pounds of torque. So there again, we're using old hardware, so we're going to go on the low end of the spectrum. And we're going to put it at 45. It does not specify anything different between diesel and gas on this step. And there's not really much you can do as far as stage torque. You can just kind of pull everything a little bit deeper feel. And then just pull it to your final torque. And once all that's good, we'll give it another spin check. And we're still moving nice and free. Okay, so now we're going to do that for the next 3 pistons.